David Harrington had always been a man of ambition, a tech titan whose name was synonymous with innovation and success. He had built an empire from the ground up, transforming the way the world connected and communicated. For decades, his company had been at the forefront of technology, and David had become a household name, a symbol of what was possible with vision and relentless determination. But on a cold December afternoon, everything changed. David sat in his penthouse office, high above the bustling streets of Manhattan, his eyes fixed on the city's skyline. The view, which once filled him with pride, now felt like a distant memory, a relic from a life that was slipping through his fingers. The news had come only hours before, delivered by his longtime physician, Dr. Thomas Weaver, with a somber expression that David knew all too well. "David, we need to talk," Dr. Weaver had said, his voice heavy with the weight of what was to come. "The test came back, and I'm afraid the results aren't good." David had heard the words, but they felt distant, as if they were being spoken to someone else. Terminal illness, a phrase that seemed so foreign, so out of place in his life. Yet it had become his new reality. The prognosis was grim, months, perhaps a year if he was lucky. But it wasn't the diagnosis alone that crushed him. It was the other revelation that came with it. "There's something else, David," Dr. Weaver had continued, hesitating before delivering the final blow. "We've also discovered that you're infertile. It's likely you've been your entire life." Infertile. The word echoed in David's mind, a cruel twist of fate that felt almost like a cosmic joke. For a man who had conquered industries, who had amassed wealth beyond comprehension, the one thing he could never achieve was the simplest, most fundamental aspect of life: leaving behind a piece of himself. His legacy, the one thing that truly mattered, would die with him. In the days that followed, David withdrew from the world. Meetings were canceled, appearances postponed. He found himself wandering through his penthouse, lost in thought, consumed by the realization that everything he had built, everything he had fought for, would one day vanish as if it had never existed. The Harrington name, his name, would be nothing more than a footnote in history. It was in this state of despair that David began to question the meaning of his life. What had it all been for? The billions in the bank, the accolades, the power, none of it seemed to matter anymore. What was the point of it all if, in the end, there was no one to carry it forward? He spent hours staring at old family photos, at the faces of his parents, long gone, and his younger self, full of hope and promise. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his life building a future that he now realized he could never truly have. But as the days turned into weeks, something within David began to change. The despair that had once consumed him slowly transformed into a resolve, a determination to make a difference in whatever time he had left. If he could not leave behind a biological legacy, then perhaps there was another way, a way to ensure that his name, his life, meant something beyond the walls of his empire. And so, the seeds of a plan began to take root in David's mind. A plan that would take him far from the comforts of his penthouse and into the very streets he had once overlooked. He would adopt a new identity, a life free from the trappings of wealth and power, and find a way to use his fortune for something greater than himself. Little did he know, this journey would lead him to a boy named Ethan, a connection that would forever change the course of his life and redefine what it meant to leave a legacy. David Harrington stood at the edge of his penthouse, gazing out at the sprawling city below. The twinkling lights of Manhattan, once a symbol of his success, now seemed distant, almost mocking. He knew that everything he had built, everything he had worked so tirelessly to achieve, had come at a cost he was only beginning to comprehend. The decision to leave it all behind wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He needed to find something real, something meaningful, before it was too late. In the days leading up to his departure, David meticulously planned his new life. He transferred large sums of money into untraceable accounts, securing his fortune in a way that would allow him to give it away without drawing attention. He liquidated assets, sold off properties, and prepared documents that would erase David Harrington from existence. By the time he was done, the man who had once commanded boardrooms and dominated headlines was nothing more than a ghost, a shadow of his former self. On a cold, Gray morning, David walked out of his penthouse for the last time. He wore old, worn clothes, jeans that had seen better days, a tattered coat, and scuffed shoes that felt foreign on his feet. With a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he left behind the life he had known and stepped into a world he had only ever seen from afar. The streets of New York were a far cry from the polished halls of his empire. The air was thick with the scent of exhaust and the chatter of countless lives intersecting in the city that never slept. David wandered aimlessly at first, blending into the crowd as he moved through the streets. He found himself in neighborhoods he had never visited, places where his name meant nothing and his wealth even less. It wasn't long before he encountered the harsh realities of the life he had chosen. The cold bit at his skin, the hunger gnawed at his stomach, and the indifference of those around him was a stark reminder of how invisible he had become. But this was exactly what David had wanted, to strip away the layers of privilege and see the world as it truly was. Days turned into weeks as David adjusted to his new life. He learned where to find food, where to sleep without being disturbed, and how to navigate the unspoken rules of the streets. It was a life of survival, far removed from the luxury he had once known, but in its own way, it was liberating. For the first time in years, David felt a sense of freedom, unburdened by the expectations and pressures that had once defined him. Yet, as the weeks passed, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had set out on this journey to make a difference, but so far, he had only managed to survive. The people he encountered were polite, sometimes even kind, but there was a distance between them, a barrier that his wealth, though hidden, could not cross. He had become just another face in the crowd, and while that anonymity was what he had sought, it left him feeling more alone than ever. It was during one of these long, lonely nights that David found himself in a small park, sitting on a bench as the city hummed around him. He watched as people hurried by, lost in their own worlds, unaware of the man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in the city. He was beginning to wonder if his plan had been a mistake when he heard a small, hesitant voice behind him. "Excuse me, sir, are you okay?" David turned to see a young boy, no older than 7 or 8, standing a few feet away. The boy's clothes were worn, his face smudged with dirt, but his eyes were bright and curious. There was something about the boy that struck David, something familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. "I'm fine," David replied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." The boy nodded, stepping closer. "You look sad." "My mom says it's okay to be sad sometimes." David felt a pang of emotion at the boy's words, a reminder of the child he had never had, the legacy that would never be. "Your mom sounds like a smart woman," he said softly. The boy smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "She is, but she's gone now. It's just me." David's heart ached at the boy's words. He had set out on this journey to find meaning, and now, here was this child, alone in the world, reaching out to him. It was as if fate had brought them together. And for the first time in weeks, David felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of purpose. "What's your name?" David asked, his voice gentle. "Ethan," the boy replied. "Ethan Harrington." The name hit David like a bolt of lightning, leaving him speechless. Ethan Harrington? It was impossible. Yet here he was, standing in front of a boy who shared his name, who had somehow found him in the vastness of the city. In that moment, David knew his journey had just begun. David Harrington couldn't shake the shock of the boy's words. Ethan Harrington. The name echoed in his mind, a name that was his, yet belonged to this child who had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. For a moment, he questioned whether this was some cruel trick of fate, a hallucination brought on by his exhaustion and the weight of his illness. But as he looked into Ethan's eyes, so full of innocence and sincerity, he knew this was no figment of his imagination. "Ethan Harrington?" David repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. That's my name." Ethan's face lit up with a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Your name too? Are you my dad?" The question hung in the air, heavy and disorienting. David's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to find words, his mind racing to make sense of the situation. He had no children, no family left that bore his name, And yet here was this boy, lost, alone, and seemingly connected to him in a way that defied logic. I don't know, Ethan," David finally managed, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "I don't think so. I didn't know I had a son." Ethan's brow furrowed, confusion clouding his features. "But my mom said my dad's name was David Harrington. She said he was a great man, but he couldn't be with us. She told me to find you if anything ever happened to her." David's breath caught in his throat. The boy's words stirred something deep within him, an ache that he hadn't felt in years. Could it be possible? Could this child somehow be connected to him? But how? His mind reeled with questions, yet he knew this wasn't the time for them. Right now, Ethan needed him. "What happened to your mom, Ethan?" David asked gently, though the answer terrified him. Ethan's eyes filled with tears as he looked down at his worn shoes. She got sick, really sick. She tried to take care of me, but then she couldn't anymore. She said if anything happened, I should find you. I tried to take care of her, but she didn't wake up one day. David's heart shattered at the boy's words. He had experienced loss, but nothing like this, nothing so raw and innocent. He reached out, pulling Ethan into a gentle embrace, the boy's small frame trembling as he cried softly against David's chest. In that moment, all of David's doubts and questions faded away, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct. It didn't matter how or why this boy had come into his life. What mattered was that he was here, and he needed David. "It's okay, Ethan," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here now. I'm not going to leave you." Ethan clung to David, his tears soaking through David's worn coat. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, the world around them fading into nothingness. For the first time since his diagnosis, David felt a sense of purpose, a clarity that had been missing from his life. This child, this boy who shared his name, had become his reason to fight, to keep going. When Ethan finally pulled away, his eyes were red and puffy, but there was a glimmer of hope in them. "Are you really my dad?" he asked again, his voice small and tentative. David knelt down to Ethan's level, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I don't know, Ethan," he admitted, "but I promise you this. I'll be here for you, no matter what. We'll figure this out together." Ethan nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. "Thank you, Dad," he said, the word hesitant but filled with trust. David's heart swelled with emotion. He had never imagined himself in this role, never thought he would be called Dad by anyone. But now, hearing it from Ethan, it felt right, like something he had been missing all his life without even knowing it. As they walked through the streets of New York together, side by side, David felt a shift within himself. The city, once a cold and indifferent place, now seemed full of possibility, of second chances. Ethan talked as they walked, his small voice filling the silence that had once been so oppressive. He spoke of his mother, of the little things she had done to make their life together special, even when times were tough. He spoke of his dreams, of how he wanted to be a scientist someday, just like the people who made the cool gadgets on TV. David listened, absorbing every word, every detail. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly alive. By the time the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city, David knew that his life had changed forever. Ethan was more than just a connection to his past. He was his future, his second chance at leaving a legacy that mattered. And as they found a place to rest for the night, David knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't face them alone. As the days passed, David and Ethan settled into an unexpected routine. Their bond grew stronger with each passing hour, with David taking on the role of protector and provider in a way he had never imagined. He found himself doing things that felt both foreign and oddly comforting, scavenging for food, finding safe places to sleep, and navigating the unspoken rules of life on the streets. It was a stark contrast to the life he had once known, but it was a life he was beginning to understand in ways he never thought possible. Yet, despite their growing closeness, there were still moments when David sensed a distance in Ethan, a shadow of something unspoken, something that lingered just beneath the surface. He saw it in the way Ethan would sometimes fall silent, his bright eyes clouded with memories he didn't share. It wasn't until one particularly cold evening that David began to uncover the secrets Ethan had been keeping. They had found shelter in an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, a place that offered a bit more protection from the biting wind. As they huddled together, trying to stay warm, Ethan's demeanor shifted. He became quieter than usual, his gaze fixed on the dark corners of the room, as if seeing something that wasn't there. "Ethan," David said softly, breaking the silence, "you've been really quiet tonight. Is something bothering you?" Ethan hesitated, his small hands fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "It's nothing really, just memories." David's heart ached at the boy's words. He had been patient, waiting for Ethan to open up, but now he felt the need to push just a little, to offer the comfort the boy so clearly needed. "You can talk to me, Ethan," David encouraged, his voice gentle. "Whatever it is, I'm here to listen." Ethan glanced at David, his expression conflicted. He took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage, before finally speaking. "It's about my mom and what happened before she got sick." David listened intently, knowing that whatever Ethan was about to share was important. He nodded, encouraging Ethan to continue. "She didn't always talk about you, you know," Ethan began, his voice tinged with a mix of sadness and confusion. "When I was younger, she used to tell me stories about you. How you were this great man who did amazing things, but you couldn't be with us because you had to take care of a lot of people. But as I got older, she stopped talking about you so much. She got scared, like she was hiding something." David felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea what Ethan's mother might have been afraid of, but the fear in Ethan's voice was unmistakable. "Did she ever tell you why she was scared?" he asked, trying to keep his own anxiety at bay. Ethan shook his head, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Not really, but I remember there were times when men would come to our apartment. They'd talk to my mom, and she'd always seem really upset afterward. She'd tell me to hide in my room and not come out until they were gone." David's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Who were these men, and what could they have wanted from Ethan's mother? He could feel the unease building in his chest, but he kept his focus on Ethan, who was clearly struggling to make sense of his memories. "One night," Ethan continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I woke up and heard my mom crying. I went to her room, but when I got there, she was on the phone with someone. She didn't see me, but I heard her say something about a man named Harrington. She said she was scared he'd find out." David's blood ran cold. He didn't know what to think, but one thing was clear. There was more to this story than he had realized. Could it be possible that Ethan's mother had some connection to him? Something that had driven her to hide? And if so, what could it mean for Ethan? "What else did she say?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ethan looked up at David, his eyes filled with worry. She said that if anything happened to her, I should find you. She said you'd protect me. But I don't understand, David. Why would she be scared of you?" David's heart clenched at the question. He didn't have an answer, but he knew he had to find one. For Ethan's sake, he needed to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. But before he could speak, Ethan continued. "After that, things got worse," Ethan admitted, his voice trembling. "My mom got sick, and those men kept coming. They talk about money, about how she owed them. But we didn't have any money. She was scared all the time, and then she was gone." David's chest tightened with a mix of anger and sorrow. Whoever these men were, they had caused Ethan and his mother unimaginable pain. But now, they were gone, leaving only questions and a boy who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. David pulled Ethan into a hug, holding him close as he tried to offer what little comfort he could. "Ethan," he said softly, "I don't know why your mom was scared, but I promise you I'll find out. I'll protect you, just like she wanted." Ethan nodded against David's chest, his small body trembling with emotion. "I'm scared, David," he whispered. "What if they come back? What if they find us?" David's resolve hardened. He had made a promise to protect this boy, and he would do whatever it took to keep him safe. But he also knew that they couldn't stay in the shadows forever. They needed answers. Answers that would only come with confronting the past. "They won't find us, Ethan," David reassured him, his voice firm. "And if they do, they'll have to get through me first. But we're not going to let that happen. We'll figure this out together." As they sat there in the darkness, David knew that their journey was only just beginning. The secrets that had brought Ethan to him were still buried, but he was determined to uncover them, no matter where they led. For the first time in his life, David understood what it meant to truly care for someone else, to put their safety and happiness above all else. And as he held Ethan close, he vowed that nothing would stop him from protecting this boy, his boy, from whatever dangers lay ahead. The days that followed were tense, filled with a sense of unease that neither David nor Ethan could shake. The city's streets, once a refuge of anonymity, now felt like a maze of threats and unanswered questions. David knew they couldn't continue living in the shadows indefinitely, not with the specter of Ethan's past hanging over them. He had to get to the bottom of the mystery surrounding the boy's mother and the men who had haunted her final days. But where to begin? The world David once navigated with ease now felt like a different universe. One where money and power meant little without the connections and resources he'd left behind. Yet he was determined. For Ethan's sake, he would find a way. One evening, as they sat together on a bench in a quiet park, David decided it was time to start piecing together the fragments of Ethan's past. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass, and the city was beginning to settle into the rhythm of the night. Ethan was drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick, his expression distant, lost in thought. "Ethan," David began softly, not wanting to startle the boy, "I need to ask you something. It's important, but it might be hard for you to talk about." Ethan looked up, his eyes full of questions, but no fear. In the short time they had known each other, he had come to trust David completely, sensing the man's genuine care and concern. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady. David took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Those men who came to see your mom, do you remember anything about them? Anything at all? What they looked like, what they talked about, anything that might help us understand who they were?" Ethan frowned, his brows knitting together as he tried to recall the details. "They were scary," he said after a moment, his voice tinged with the fear he had felt at the time. "They were always dressed in dark clothes, like they didn't want anyone to notice them. But I remember one of them, he had a scar on his face, right here." He pointed to a spot just below his eye. "And he always smelled like smoke." David nodded, filing the information away. A scarred man who smelled like smoke. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Did they ever say why they wanted money from your mom? Did she ever talk to you about it?" Ethan hesitated, biting his lip as he thought. "They didn't talk a lot when I was around, but I heard them say something about a debt. They said my mom owed them, and if she didn't pay, they'd make her pay in other ways." David's heart clenched at the thought of what that might have meant. He could only imagine the terror Ethan's mother had lived with, trying to protect her son while dealing with threats she couldn't escape. "And your mom, she never told you who they were? Why she owed them?" Ethan shook his head, his expression troubled. "No, she just told me to stay away from them, to hide whenever they came. She said they were dangerous." David felt a surge of frustration. The pieces were there, but they didn't fit together, at least not yet. He needed more information, but asking Ethan to relive those memories was clearly taking a toll on the boy. He could see the fear returning to Ethan's eyes, the same fear that had been there when they first met. "It's okay, Ethan," David said quickly, reaching out to place a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't have to remember everything right now. We'll figure this out together, I promise." Ethan nodded, but David could see the worry still etched on his face. "David, do you think they're still looking for us? For me?" David wanted to say no, to reassure Ethan that they were safe, but he couldn't lie. Not when he didn't know the truth himself. "I don't know, Ethan," he admitted, his voice gentle. "But I do know this. We're not going to let them hurt you. I'll protect you, no matter what." Ethan looked up at David, his eyes filled with trust. "I believe you," he said simply, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. As the night grew darker, David made a decision. They couldn't keep running blindly, hiding from shadows without understanding the dangers that lurked within them. They needed help, someone who knew the world David had left behind, someone who could dig into the past without raising too many questions. The following morning, David led Ethan to a small, dingy cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was a place he hadn't visited in years, a relic from his past life. The cafe was a meeting spot for those who operated in the gray areas of the city, people who had connections to both the underworld and the elite. David had come here in the early days of his career, making deals that helped him climb the ladder of success. He hoped the cafe still attracted the same kind of crowd. As they entered, the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke hit David's senses, bringing back memories he had long buried. The patrons barely looked up from their conversations, their eyes glazed with indifference. David scanned the room, searching for a familiar face, until his gaze landed on a man sitting alone in a corner booth, his back to the wall. The man looked up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized David. He was older now, with more gray in his hair and lines etched deeply into his face. But there was no mistaking the sharp intelligence behind those eyes. He was a fixer, someone who could find out anything for the right price. And David knew he was the key to unraveling the mystery of Ethan's past. "David Harrington," the man said as David approached, his voice low and gravelly. "I never thought I'd see you here again. What brings you back to the land of the living?" David glanced at Ethan, who stood close by, before turning his attention back to the man. "I need information, Gus. And I need it fast." Gus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Information, huh? Must be important if it's got you crawling out of whatever hole you've been hiding in." "It is," David replied, his tone serious. "I need to know everything you can find out about a woman, Ethan's mother. She was being threatened by some men, and I need to know who they were and why." Gus's gaze shifted to Ethan, who was watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and caution. "This kid yours?" Gus asked, his tone more neutral now. David hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he is." Gus studied David for a moment, then leaned back in his seat. "All right, David. I'll see what I can do. But it won't be easy, and it won't be cheap." David reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it on the table in front of Gus. "Money isn't a problem. Just give me the answers." Gus smirked, taking the envelope and slipping it into his jacket. "Consider it done. I'll be in touch." As David and Ethan left the cafe, David felt a renewed sense of determination. They were finally taking steps toward uncovering the truth. And with Gus's help, they would get the answers they needed. But with those answers would come new challenges, new dangers. David knew one thing for certain. No matter what lay ahead, he would face it head on. For Ethan, he would do whatever it took to protect him and uncover the secrets that had torn his world apart. Days turned into a tense waiting game as David and Ethan continued their cautious existence on the streets, the promise of answers looming like a dark cloud on the horizon. David kept close watch over Ethan, trying to shield him from the harsh realities of their situation, while his own mind churned with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. He knew that once Gus came through with the information, there would be no turning back. Whatever truths they uncovered would change everything, for better or for worse. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows over the city, David's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart racing as he saw Gus's name flash on the screen. It was the call he had been waiting for. "David," Gus's gravelly voice came through the line, low and serious. "I've got what you asked for. Meet me at the warehouse on 12th and Greenwich. Come alone." David's stomach tightened with a mixture of dread and determination. "I'll be there," he replied before hanging up. He turned to Ethan, who was sitting beside him on a park bench, playing with a small, worn toy car they had found earlier that day. "I need to go meet someone," David said, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's about your mom. I want you to stay here." "Okay, I'll be back soon." Ethan looked up, worry flashing in his eyes. "Are you going to be okay?" David forced a reassuring smile. "I'll be fine. Just stay here and keep a low profile. I promise I'll be back before you know it." Ethan nodded, though his expression remained tense. "Okay, be careful." With a final squeeze of Ethan's shoulder, David turned and walked away, his mind racing with what Gus might have uncovered. The streets blurred around him as he made his way to the warehouse, each step heavy with the weight of what was to come. The warehouse was a relic from a bygone era, its once sturdy walls now crumbling and covered in graffiti. It stood at the edge of the city, a forgotten place where shadows seemed to gather and linger. David approached cautiously, his senses on high alert, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. As he stepped inside, the air grew colder, the dim light casting long, eerie shadows across the empty space. Gus was waiting for him near the center of the room, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness. David approached, his heart pounding in his chest. "You made it," Gus said, his tone devoid of any warmth. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, tattered file, handing it to David. "Everything you need to know is in there." David took the file, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside were a few sheets of paper, some old photographs, and a handwritten note that looked like it had been scribbled in haste. As he began to read, the world around him seemed to fade away, the words on the page pulling him into a past he had never known. The file detailed Ethan's mother's life, her struggles, her fears, and the relentless men who had pursued her. They were debt collectors, enforcers for a criminal organization that had preyed on the vulnerable and desperate. But the most shocking revelation was buried in the final pages, a connection between Ethan's mother and David's past that he had never seen coming. Years ago, before David had become the powerful man he was today, he had made a series of investments in fledgling companies, some of which had ties to unsavory individuals. One of those investments had indirectly funded the very organization that had terrorized Ethan's mother. Unbeknownst to David, his wealth had contributed to the suffering of the woman who had brought Ethan into the world. David's hands clenched around the file, a wave of guilt and anger washing over him. How could he have been so blind, so careless? The very money that had built his empire had also destroyed lives, including the life of the woman who might have been connected to him in ways he could hardly comprehend. As he reached the last page, his breath caught in his throat. There, among the faded documents, was a birth certificate, Ethan's birth certificate. And in the space where the father's name was listed, there it was, David Harrington. David's mind reeled, his world spinning out of control. Ethan wasn't just some boy who had crossed his path by chance. He was his son, his flesh and blood. The one thing he had believed he could never have, the legacy he had thought was out of reach, was standing right before him, waiting for him to return. Gus watched David's reaction with a knowing look, as if he had anticipated this all along. "Looks like you've got more in common with the kid than you thought, huh?" David didn't respond immediately, his thoughts too chaotic to form words. He stared at the birth certificate, trying to process the enormity of what he had just learned. Ethan was his son. The boy he had vowed to protect, to care for, was his own flesh and blood. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave, washing away the last remnants of doubt and hesitation. He turned to Gus, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Who else knows about this?" Gus shook his head. "Just me. And now you. But those men, they're still out there, David. And if they find out you're the boy's father, they'll come after you both. They're not the kind to leave loose ends." David's jaw tightened with resolve. "Then we'll make sure they never find out. And we'll stop them from hurting anyone else ever again." Gus nodded, respecting the determination in David's voice. "I figured you'd say that. Just be careful. You're in deep now, deeper than you've ever been." David took the file, tucking it securely under his arm. "I've got everything I need. Thanks, Gus." With that, he turned and walked out of the warehouse, his mind racing with plans and strategies. He knew now that he couldn't stay hidden forever. He had to face the threat head-on, not just for Ethan's sake, but for his own. There was no going back to the life he had left behind, no retreating into the shadows. The truth was out, and there was only one way forward. As David made his way back to the park, his heart pounded with a mix of fear and hope. He had found his son, a son he had never known he had, a son who had been living in fear and danger for far too long. And now, it was up to him to make things right, to ensure that Ethan's future was safe and secure. When he reached the park, the sun had set, and the city lights flickered to life around him. Ethan was still sitting on the bench, his small figure illuminated by the streetlights. As David approached, Ethan looked up, his face lighting up with relief at the sight of him. "David, you're back," Ethan called out, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and worry. David knelt down in front of Ethan, his heart swelling with a fatherly love he had never known before. "Ethan, there's something I need to tell you." Ethan's eyes widened, sensing the seriousness in David's tone. "What is it?" David took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Ethan, I found out something about your mom, something important. And I found out something about us, too." Ethan looked up at David, his expression a mix of curiosity and fear. "What do you mean?" David reached out, taking Ethan's small hand in his own. "Ethan, I'm your father. You're my son." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Ethan stared at David, his eyes wide with shock, his mind struggling to process the words. "You're my dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. David nodded, his heart aching with emotion. "Yes, Ethan, I'm your dad, and I'm so sorry I didn't know sooner. But I promise you from now on, I'll always be here for you. We'll face whatever comes our way together." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes as he looked at David, his expression a mix of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. "I always wanted a dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never thought it would be you." David pulled Ethan into a tight embrace, holding him close as the boy's tears soaked into his jacket. "I'm here now, Ethan," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm not going anywhere. We're a family, and nothing will ever change that." As they held each other under the flickering streetlights, David knew that their journey was far from over. There were still dangers ahead, still secrets to uncover and battles to fight. But for the first time in his life, he felt whole. He had found the one thing he had been searching for all along, the one thing that made all the sacrifices and struggles worth it. He had found his son, and together, they would face whatever the future held. The revelation of their true relationship deepened the bond between David and Ethan in ways neither of them could have anticipated. In the days that followed, they became inseparable, navigating the harsh realities of the streets with a newfound sense of purpose and unity. David's determination to protect Ethan, now fully realized as his son, became his driving force. But with that realization came an even heavier burden. The knowledge that the men who had terrorized Ethan's mother would not stop until they had what they wanted. David knew that to keep Ethan safe, they needed to disappear, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that running wasn't the answer. He had spent too much of his life hiding behind wealth and power, avoiding the messiness of human connection. Now, with Ethan by his side, he understood that real strength came not from avoiding conflict but from facing it head-on. One evening, as they sat in a small, dimly lit diner tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, David broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few patrons scattered across the room, their heads bowed over steaming cups of coffee. The flickering neon sign outside cast a soft, red glow through the windows, creating an atmosphere of quiet reflection. "Ethan," David began, watching the boy as he toyed with the edge of his napkin, "I've been thinking a lot about what we need to do next." Ethan looked up, his eyes filled with curiosity and concern. "What do you mean?" David sighed, choosing his words carefully. "We can't keep running. I've tried that, and it's not the life I want for us. We need to confront these men, figure out what they want, and put an end to this once and for all." Ethan's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and admiration flashing across his face. "But how are we going to do that? They're dangerous, David. They hurt my mom. What if they hurt you?" David reached across the table, placing his hand over Ethan's. "I'm not going to let that happen, Ethan. I've spent my life building walls around myself, thinking that money and power would keep me safe. But now, I see that real strength comes from standing up for the people you care about, from facing your fears instead of running from them." Ethan listened intently, his young mind processing the weight of David's words. "So, you're not scared?" David smiled softly, a warmth in his eyes that had been missing for so long. "Of course I'm scared, but being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right, even when you're scared. And what's right is making sure you're safe, making sure we're together." Ethan nodded slowly, a sense of resolve beginning to form within him. He had been through so much, more than any child should ever have to endure. But now, with David by his side, he felt stronger. For the first time, he believed that they could face whatever was coming. "So, What do we do? Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the fear that lingered at the edges of his mind. David took a deep breath, the plan he had been formulating finally taking shape. First, we need to get some answers. I need to find out exactly what these men want and why they're so determined to get it. Then, we can figure out how to stop them. Ethan's eyes darkened with a memory. I remember they kept talking about money, about something my mom had, but she always said she didn't have anything. She was scared, David. Really scared. David's jaw tightened at the thought of what Ethan's mother must have gone through. She was protecting you, Ethan. Whatever it was, she wanted to keep you safe. And now, it's up to us to finish what she started. Ethan nodded, his small hand tightening around David's. I'm with you, Dad. Whatever happens, I'm with you. David's heart swelled at the word. Asterisk Dad star. It was still new, still strange, but it was right. We'll do this together, David said, his voice filled with determination. But we'll need help. We can't do this alone. David's mind turned to the people he had known in his previous life, the contacts and connections he had severed when he walked away from it all. There was one person who came to mind, someone he had worked with in the early days of building his empire, someone who had always operated in the shadows but was fiercely loyal to those he trusted. Ethan, David said, a plan forming in his mind. There's someone I need to find, someone who can help us. He's not the kind of person who operates in the open, but he knows things and he can get us what we need. Who is he? Ethan asked, curiosity piqued. His name is Marcus, David replied, his voice carrying the weight of history. He's the fixer, a problem solver. He helped me when I was first starting out, and he owes me a favor. If anyone can help us get to the bottom of this, it's him. Ethan nodded, trusting David's judgment. Where do we find him? That's the tricky part, David said with a wry smile. Marcus doesn't like to be found, but I know where he used to hang out, and if he's still in the game, we'll find him. The next morning, David and Ethan set out on their search. They moved carefully through the city, staying under the radar as much as possible. David led them to a series of locations, old haunts and hidden spots where the underworld of the city conducted its business. They searched for hours, following leads that seemed to lead nowhere, but David refused to give up. Finally, as the day began to fade into evening, they found themselves in front of a nondescript building in a run-down part of town. The sign above the door was faded, the letters barely visible, but David recognized it immediately. It was a speakeasy, a place where deals were made and secrets were kept. David pushed open the door, the sound of jazz music and low conversation filling the air. The room was dimly lit, the patrons scattered in small groups, each absorbed in their own world. David scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the familiar face he had come to find. And then he saw him. Marcus was sitting at a corner table, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the low light. He was older now, but the aura of confidence and danger that surrounded him was unmistakable. David approached the table, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and anxiety. Marcus, he said, his voice steady. It's been a long time. Marcus looked up, a slow smile spreading across his face as he recognized David. Well, if it isn't David Harrington. Thought you were dead, or at least smart enough to stay out of trouble. David shrugged, taking a seat across from Marcus. Life is a way of pulling you back in. I need your help, Marcus. Marcus took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes narrowing behind his sunglasses. Help, huh? Last time I checked, you weren't in the business of needing help. What's changed? David glanced at Ethan, who was standing close by, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and apprehension. A lot has changed, David said quietly. This is my son, Ethan, and we're in some serious trouble. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting as he took in the sight of the boy. Your son, huh? Didn't know you had it in you. All right, Harrington, tell me what's going on. David leaned in, his voice low as he explained the situation. Ethan's mother, the men who had terrorized her, the debt that had driven them to the edge, and the revelation that had turned David's world upside down. As he spoke, Marcus listened intently, his expression unreadable. When David finished, Marcus leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. You've got yourself in deep, Harrington, but I've seen worse. I can help you, but it's going to cost you. And I don't just mean money. David nodded, understanding the unspoken terms. Whatever it takes, Marcus. Just help me keep my son safe. Marcus's gaze shifted to Ethan, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. The kid's got guts, Marcus said with a nod of approval. All right, Harrington, I'll help you, but we're going to do this my way. David felt a surge of relief, tempered by the knowledge that they were about to dive even deeper into a world he had once left behind. But for Ethan's sake, he would do whatever it took. As they left the speakeasy, a sense of resolve settled over David. They were no longer running, no longer hiding. They were taking control of their destiny, facing their enemies head-on. And with Marcus on their side, they might just stand a chance. With Marcus now in the picture, David felt a cautious sense of hope. They had a plan, and for the first time, it felt like they were no longer just reacting to the threats around them. They were preparing to take action. But the journey ahead was fraught with danger, and David knew that every step they took would bring them closer to a final confrontation that could determine their fate. Marcus moved quickly, setting up a temporary safe house for David and Ethan in a discreet location on the outskirts of the city. It was a far cry from the luxury David had once known, but it offered the security they desperately needed. The small apartment was bare, with only the essentials, a few beds, a kitchenette, and a single table where they could plan their next moves. But it was enough. For now, it was home. The days that followed were intense, filled with strategy sessions and late-night conversations. Marcus began to dig into the criminal organization that had targeted Ethan's mother, using his extensive network of contacts to gather information. David, on the other hand, focused on preparing Ethan for what lay ahead. He knew that the boy needed to be strong, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. One evening, as they sat together in the dim light of the apartment, David decided it was time to talk to Ethan about what they were truly up against. He had been shielding the boy from the worst of it, but he knew that wasn't fair. Ethan needed to understand the stakes. Ethan, David began, his voice steady but serious. We're getting closer to finding out who these men are and what they want. But there's something I need to tell you. Something important. Ethan looked up from the book he had been reading, his eyes wide with attention. What is it, Dad? David took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. What we're doing, it's dangerous. These men, they're not going to back down easily. They've hurt people before, and they won't hesitate to do it again if it means getting what they want. That's why we need to be prepared for anything. Ethan nodded, his expression serious but calm. I understand, Dad. I'm not scared. David smiled softly, feeling a swell of pride for his son. I know you're not, Ethan. You're brave. Braver than I ever was at your age. But being brave doesn't mean we have to face this alone. We have Marcus, and we have each other. No matter what happens, we stick together. Ethan reached out and took David's hand, his grip firm. I trust you, Dad. I know you'll keep me safe. David's heart ached at the trust in Ethan's eyes, a trust he was determined not to betray. I will, Ethan. I promise you I will. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus's investigation began to yield results. He uncovered a web of corruption and greed that stretched far beyond what David had imagined. The criminal organization that had targeted Ethan's mother wasn't just after money. They were after something far more valuable: control. They had ties to powerful figures in the city, people who had used their influence to cover up their crimes and protect their interests. And at the center of it all was a man named Victor Kane, a ruthless businessman with a reputation for getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. Kane had been using his wealth and connections to manipulate the city's underworld for years, amassing power and eliminating anyone who stood in his way. Ethan's mother had become collateral damage in one of Kane's schemes, a pawn in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. When Marcus presented this information to David, the weight of it hit him like a freight train. Kane was untouchable in the traditional sense. His money and power protected him from the law. But David knew that he couldn't let that stop him. For Ethan's sake, he had to find a way to bring Kane down, to expose him for the monster he was. As they sat around the small table in the safe house, Marcus laid out the final piece of the plan. Kane's hosting a charity gala in a few days. Marcus explained, his voice low and deliberate. It's going to be a big event. Politicians, celebrities, the whole 9 yards. But what most people don't know is that Kane uses these events to broker his most important deals. It's the perfect cover. David listened intently, his mind racing with possibilities. So, we infiltrate the gala, get close to Cain, and gather the evidence we need to bring him down? Marcus nodded. Exactly. But it won't be easy. Security's going to be tight, and Cain's no fool. If he even suspects something's off, he'll shut it down and disappear. We need to be smart, and we need to be fast. Ethan, who had been quietly absorbing the conversation, finally spoke up. I want to help, he said, his voice firm. I can do something. I know I can. David looked at his son, torn between wanting to protect him and knowing that Ethan was right. This was a fight for their future, and Ethan had every right to be a part of it. All right, Ethan, David said after a moment. But you have to promise me you'll be careful. No unnecessary risks. We do this together. Ethan nodded, his eyes shining with determination. I promise, Dad. The night of the gala arrived faster than any of them had expected. David and Ethan dressed in simple but elegant clothes, blending in with the crowd of wealthy socialites and power players who filled the grand ballroom. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sound of clinking glasses, a stark contrast to the tension that simmered just below the surface. David's eyes scanned the room, searching for their target. It wasn't long before he spotted Victor Cain, tall, impeccably dressed and surrounded by sycophants eager to win his favor. Cain's smile was charming, his demeanor polished, but David could see the cold calculation in his eyes. This was a man who saw people as tools, resources to be exploited and discarded when they were no longer useful. As they moved through the crowd, Marcus kept a close watch on their surroundings, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He had set up a discreet communication system, allowing them to stay in contact without drawing attention. All right, Harrington, Marcus's voice crackled in David's earpiece. Cain's heading to the VIP section. That's where we need to get him. David nodded subtly, his heart pounding with adrenaline. He guided Ethan through the throng of people, keeping a low profile as they made their way toward the back of the ballroom. The VIP section was cordoned off, guarded by security, but Marcus had already arranged for a distraction. One of Cain's many rivals had been tipped off about a potential business deal, and the ensuing argument provided the perfect cover for David and Ethan to slip past the guards. Inside the VIP section, the atmosphere was even more exclusive, the conversations more guarded. David could feel the tension in the air as they approached Cain, who was deep in conversation with a group of influential businessmen. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. As David got closer, his earpiece crackled again. Now, David, Marcus's voice instructed. Engage him. Get him talking. David took a deep breath, then stepped forward, positioning himself within earshot of Cain. Mr. Cain, he said, his voice steady. I couldn't help but overhear. You're quite the topic of conversation tonight. Cain turned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he appraised David. And you are? David Harrington, David replied, extending his hand. We haven't met, but I've heard a lot about you. Impressive portfolio. Cain's expression remained unreadable as he shook David's hand, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew exactly who David was. Harrington, you say? I thought you'd retire from the game. Some games are too interesting to walk away from, David said, his tone light but loaded with meaning. Cain studied David for a moment, then nodded, a sly smile spreading across his face. Indeed, but in this business, you know how important it is to stay ahead. Only the sharpest survive. As they spoke, Ethan quietly moved into position, staying close to David but out of Cain's direct line of sight. He was carrying a small device Marcus had given him, something that would allow them to capture the conversation and any incriminating evidence Cain might let slip. David continued to engage Cain, steering the conversation toward the kind of deals Cain preferred to keep hidden. He knew it was a delicate balance. Push too hard, and Cain would shut down. But if he could just get Cain to reveal something, anything that could be used against him. And then it happened. In a moment of arrogance, Cain let his guard down, bragging about a recent acquisition that had gone smoothly thanks to his connections. It was vague, but it was enough. Ethan discreetly activated the device, capturing Cain's words before anyone could notice. As soon as they had what they needed, David signaled to Ethan, and they began to withdraw, moving back through the crowd with practiced ease. But just as they reached the edge of the VIP section, Kane's voice cut through the noise, stopping them in their tracks. "Leaving so soon, Harrington?" Kane's tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, a hint of suspicion. David turned, forcing a smile. "Just stepping out for some air. It's a bit stuffy in here." Kane nodded slowly, but his eyes were sharp, probing. "Of course. But you know, Harrington, it's a small world. You never know who's watching." David's pulse quickened, but he maintained his composure. "Good advice, Mr. Kane. I'll keep that in mind." With that, David and Ethan slipped out of the ballroom, their hearts pounding as they made their way back to the safety of the streets. The night air was cool against their skin, a stark contrast to the tension that still clung to them. As they walked, David turned to Ethan, a sense of pride and relief washing over him. "You did great, Ethan. I'm so proud of you." Ethan looked up at his father, his eyes shining with a mix of excitement and determination. "We did it, Dad. We got what we needed." David nodded, knowing that the night's success was just the beginning. They had struck a blow against Kane, but the fight was far from over. There would be more challenges, more risks, but they would face them together. As they walked into the night, David felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. This was his legacy, not the empire he had built or the wealth he had amassed, but the bond he had forged with his son. A bond that no amount of money could buy, a legacy that would endure long after the final battle had been fought. They had each other, and that was enough. The days following the gala were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus worked tirelessly to analyze the recording they had captured, cross-referencing it with the information he had gathered about Kane's operations. Every word, every inflection was scrutinized for clues, and what they found was more than enough to bring the entire corrupt empire crashing down. David and Ethan stayed close, their bond growing even stronger as they prepared for what was to come. They knew that the recording was their key to taking down Kane, but they also knew that the most dangerous part of their journey was still ahead of them. Kane wouldn't go down without a fight, and they had to be ready for anything. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the safe house, Marcus called them into the small living room. The usually unflappable fixer had a grim look on his face, his eyes betraying the seriousness of the situation. "We've got him," Marcus said, holding up a flash drive. "This recording is the smoking gun. It ties Kane to a string of illegal activities, money laundering, bribery, you name it. But there's more. Kane's been using his charity as a front to funnel money into offshore accounts, all under the radar. He's got enough dirt on the city's elite to bury them all, and that's why he's been untouchable." Until now, David felt a surge of hope, tempered by the reality of what lay ahead. "So, what's the plan? How do we use this to take him down?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "We need to hit him where it hurts, publicly. If we can expose this to the right people, we'll force his hand. He won't be able to buy his way out of this. Not with the kind of evidence we've got. But we have to be smart about it. If Kane even suspects that we're onto him, he'll disappear and we'll lose our chance." David nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "So, we make it public, fast before he can react." "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "But we need a platform, something big enough to get the attention of everyone who matters." "That's where you come in, David. You've got the connections, the name. You can get this out there." David's mind raced as he considered their options. He had spent years building relationships with influential people in the media, and while he had distanced himself from that world, he knew he could still leverage those connections. But doing so would mean exposing himself and Ethan to a level of scrutiny they hadn't faced before. "I'll do it," David said finally, his voice steady with resolve. "I'll reach out to the press, make sure this story breaks wide open. But we have to be prepared for the fallout. Kane's not going to go down quietly." Marcus nodded, his expression grim. "He's going to come after you, David. After both of you. He'll throw everything he has at you to protect himself." David glanced at Ethan, who was listening intently, his young face set with determination. "We'll be ready. Whatever it takes, we'll see this through." The next morning, David made the call. He reached out to a trusted contact in the media, someone who had a reputation for fearless reporting. It took some convincing, but once David laid out the evidence, the reporter agreed to run the story. They set a plan in motion to release the information simultaneously across multiple outlets, ensuring that the story would spread too quickly for Kane to contain. As the hours ticked by, tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. David, Ethan, and Marcus stayed close to the safe house, monitoring the news and preparing for the inevitable backlash. When the story finally broke, it was explosive. Headlines blared across every major news outlet, detailing the corruption and crimes of Victor Kane. The recording of Kane's voice, smug and confident as he discussed his illegal deals, was played on loop, leaving no doubt about his guilt. For a brief moment, there was a sense of victory, a feeling that justice was finally within reach. But that feeling was short-lived. As predicted, Kane's response was swift and brutal. Just hours after the story broke, Marcus's phone rang. He answered it with a frown, listening intently before muttering a string of curses under his breath. "We've got a problem," he said, turning to David and Ethan. "Kane's put a bounty on your heads. He's calling in favors, mobilizing every goon he's got. We need to move now." David's heart pounded as he realized the full extent of the danger they were in. They had expected retaliation, but not on this scale. "Where do we go?" he asked, already moving to gather their things. "I've got a safe place," Marcus said quickly. "But we have to get there fast, and we have to be careful." Kane's got eyes everywhere. With adrenaline coursing through their veins, David, Ethan, and Marcus left the safe house, moving quickly and quietly through the city. They changed vehicles twice, taking back alleys and side streets to avoid detection. Every shadow felt like a threat, every passing car a potential danger. As they neared their destination, a secluded cabin on the outskirts of the city, Marcus received another call. His face darkened as he listened, his eyes narrowing with concern. When he hung up, he turned to David, his voice tense. "They're getting closer. We got to go off the grid. Completely. No phones, no contact with anyone until this blows over." David nodded, his mind racing. They were walking a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. But they were in too deep to turn back now. At the cabin, Marcus went to work fortifying their defenses, setting up surveillance, and securing the perimeter. David and Ethan stayed inside, keeping a low profile as they waited for news. The hours dragged on, each one filled with a tense silence that weighed heavily on their shoulders. As night fell, the tension became almost unbearable. David sat with Ethan in the small living room, the flickering firelight casting shadows on the walls. Ethan was quiet, but David could see the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty of what might come next. "Dad," Ethan said softly, breaking the silence, "do you think we'll be okay?" David looked at his son, his heart aching with the weight of the situation. He wanted to promise that everything would be fine, that they would come out of this unscathed, but he knew he couldn't lie. "Not now. I don't know, Ethan," he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I do know this. We're stronger together. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family. And no matter what, I'll protect you." Ethan nodded, his trust in his father unshaken. "I'm not scared, Dad. Not with you here." David smiled, pulling Ethan into a hug. In that moment, the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the bond between them. A bond that had been forged in the crucible of adversity, and that no amount of danger could break. But as the night wore on, the sense of impending danger grew stronger. Marcus remained vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the monitors, his hand never far from the gun at his side. The minutes stretched into hours, the tension mounting with each passing second. And then, in the dead of night, the attack came. It started with the sound of approaching vehicles, engines roaring as they sped down the gravel road toward the cabin. Marcus was the first to react, barking orders for David and Ethan to take cover. The cabin, though fortified, was no match for the firepower that Kane's men brought with them. The walls shook as bullets ripped through the wood, the sound deafening in the confined space. David shielded Ethan with his body, pulling him behind an overturned table as the gunfire intensified. His heart pounded with fear, but he forced himself to stay calm, to focus on keeping Ethan safe. Marcus returned fire, his years of experience showing as he expertly targeted the attackers. But they were outnumbered, and the odds were stacked against them. For what felt like an eternity, the gunfight raged on, the cabin a war zone of flying bullets and shattered wood. But despite the chaos, David refused to let go of Ethan, his grip on his son unyielding. Finally, just as it seemed the cabin would be torn apart, there was a lull in the gunfire. Marcus, bloodied but still standing, signaled for David and Ethan to move. "Go now," he shouted, his voice hoarse from the battle. David didn't hesitate. He pulled Ethan to his feet, the two of them sprinting toward the back of the cabin where Marcus had set up a hidden escape route. They crawled through a narrow tunnel that led out into the forest behind the cabin, the sounds of the attack fading as they put distance between themselves and their assailants. When they emerged into the cold night air, David and Ethan were breathless, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. They didn't stop running until they were deep into the woods, the trees offering a semblance of safety. Finally, when they could run no more, they collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for breath. David pulled Ethan close, the reality of their narrow escape sinking in. "We made it," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. David nodded, his own voice choked with emotion. "We did, Ethan. We did." But even as they caught their breath, David knew that the fight was far from over. Cain wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted, and they couldn't stay hidden forever. As they sat there in the darkness, David made a silent vow to himself and to Ethan. They had come too far, faced too many dangers to turn back now. Cain had tried to take everything from them, but David would make sure that he failed. No matter the cost, they would see this through to the end. And when it was over, they would have the one thing that truly mattered, their future together. The morning after the attack dawned cold and gray, the forest around them shrouded in a thick mist. David and Ethan had managed to find temporary refuge in an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, far from the violence of the night before. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, David knew it was time to make their final move. They couldn't keep running. Cain had proven that he would stop at nothing to protect his empire, and the longer they stayed hidden, the more danger they were in. But David also knew that they had something Cain didn't: integrity, love, and the unbreakable bond of family. It was time to end this once and for all. David turned to Ethan, who was curled up beside him on the floor, still sleeping. The boy had been through so much, more than any child should ever have to endure. Yet he had faced it all with a courage that left David in awe. He reached out and gently shook Ethan awake. "Ethan," David said softly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "It's time. We need to finish this." Ethan blinked awake, his eyes filled with the kind of resolve that belied his age. "I'm ready, Dad. Whatever we have to do, I'm with you." David smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "I know you are, son, and I couldn't be prouder of you." They quickly gathered what little they had, preparing to leave the cabin and face whatever lay ahead. Marcus had been severely injured in the attack, but before they parted ways, he had given David a final piece of advice. "Cain's going to be desperate now. You've hit him where it hurts, and he knows it. He'll be more dangerous than ever, but also more reckless. Use that." David knew Marcus was right. Cain's power had been built on fear and control, but now that foundation was crumbling. With the evidence they had gathered, and with the media already turning against him, Cain was on the defensive. It was the perfect time to strike. David and Ethan made their way back to the city, moving cautiously but with purpose. David's mind was racing with the plan they had devised. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was their best shot. They would confront Cain directly, expose him in a way that even his wealth and influence couldn't protect him from. As they approached Cain's headquarters, a towering skyscraper in the heart of the city, David felt a sense of calm wash over him. This was it, the end of the road. No more running, no more hiding. It was time to face the man who had caused so much pain and to take back their lives. They slipped into the building under the cover of the early morning shadows, using the chaos of the previous night's attack to their advantage. Security was tight, but Marcus's contacts had come through with the access codes they needed to get to Cain's private office on the top floor. The elevator ride was tense, the silence between David and Ethan thick with unspoken fears and hopes. As they ascended, David placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Whatever happens, Ethan, I want you to know how much I love you. You're my son, and nothing will ever change that." Ethan looked up at David, his eyes shining with a mixture of determination and love. "I love you too, Dad. We'll get through this together." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a long hallway lined with expensive artwork and luxurious furnishings. At the end of the hall stood a pair of heavy, ornate doors, Kane's office. David took a deep breath and stepped forward, Ethan at his side. They pushed open the doors and entered the office, where Kane was waiting. The room was a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. Calm, orderly, a facade of control. But as soon as Kane saw them, the mask slipped. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of fear and anger crossing his face. "Harrington," Kane said, his voice cold and measured. "I underestimated you." David didn't flinch. He stood tall, his voice unwavering. "It's over, Kane. The world knows what you've done. There's no hiding from it now." Kane sneered, but there was a hint of desperation in his eyes. "You think you've won? You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me? You're nothing, Harrington. You're just a man with a dead company and a worthless legacy." David felt Ethan tense beside him, but he stayed calm, meeting Kane's gaze with steely resolve. "You're wrong, Kane. I have something you'll never understand: family, love, and those things are worth more than all the money and power in the world." Kane's sneer deepened, but David could see the fear growing behind his eyes. He was losing control, and he knew it. "You're a fool," Kane spat. "I've survived worse than this. I'll bury you and your pathetic ideals." David took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "No, you won't. This is the end of the line for you, Kane. Your empire is crumbling, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." At that moment, the doors behind them burst open, and a team of federal agents flooded into the room, their guns drawn and aimed at Kane. The agents moved quickly, surrounding Kane and taking him into custody. The look of shock and betrayal on Kane's face was almost palpable as he realized that his power, his influence, had finally run out. David turned to see the lead agent, a woman with a stern expression, nodding at him in recognition. "We've been waiting for this, Harrington. The evidence you provided was the final nail in the coffin. We've got him." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. The nightmare that had haunted him and Ethan for so long was finally coming to an end. Kane, now in handcuffs, glared at David one last time as he was led away. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You'll never be free of me." But David knew better. Kane's words were empty now, the desperate ranting of a man who had lost everything. David turned away, focusing on the future that awaited him and Ethan, a future free from fear and danger. As the agents cleared the room, David and Ethan stood together, the weight of the past lifting from their shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could breathe freely. "Dad," Ethan said softly, looking up at his father. "We did it." David smiled, pulling Ethan into a tight embrace. "We did, Ethan. We did." They left Kane's office and stepped out into the morning light. The city around them was alive with the sounds of a new day, a day filled with possibilities. For the first time, David allowed himself to think about what came next. There would be rebuilding to do, both in their lives and in the world they had left behind. But they would do it together, as a family. David had learned that his legacy wasn't the company he had built or the wealth he had amassed. It was the love and strength he had found in his son. As they walked through the city, side by side, David felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The battles had been fought, the enemies defeated, but the most important victory was the one he had won within himself. He had found his son. He had found his purpose. And in that, he had found a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. A legacy of love, courage, and the unbreakable bond of family. As they walked into the future, David knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And that was all that mattered.